Understanding how to create your own patches with a synthesizer like Massive is really important, not only to create the sounds that you want, but to also affect presets to make them more catered to the sounds you're looking for. We're going to walk through Massive and explore all of the different parts and talk about how to create a sound for electronic music from scratch. When you first open up Massive, it's going to have a default patch that sounds like this. It's not super interesting, but Massive as a wavetable synthesizer has a lot of options for creating sounds. This section is where your oscillators are located, and oscillators on a synth are the foundation sounds that you start out with. With wavetable synthesis, there are a lot of options for lots of different interesting and complex sounds that you can begin with. Right now, even though Massive only has 3 oscillators, the first oscillator is the only one we're hearing. You can tell that because the amp, which is another word for volume, is all the way up on oscillator 1 and all the way down on oscillators 2 and 3. Where it says squa, which basically stands for square and sawtooth wave, if you click on this, you can find all the different options for sounds that you can start out with your oscillators. What we're hearing now is a square and a sawtooth wave combination, but we can work with something that's even more complex. There are a lot of different options for this. On this particular patch, I'm going to stick with the square sawtooth wave combination because I'm going to create a sound that's really common with electronic music called a super saw. This knob here that says WT position is what's called the wavetable position, and that's a combination of both of the waves that are involved in this selection here. We already know that we have a combination of a square and a sawtooth wave. Wherever I move this position, you will hear more of one or the other, or if it's right down the middle, you'll hear equal amounts of both. So if I want to hear 100% square wave, I'll move it all the way to the left. And 100% sawtooth all the way to the right. The other knob here that says intensity is actually just like a mini low-pass filter and cuts off high frequencies. You can choose to utilize that as well if you'd like. I'm going to stick with just a basic sawtooth wave and turn on the rest of my oscillators as well. I'm going to end up using 3 sawtooth waves to create this sound, but again, you can choose any sounds to start with. In addition, we can detune our oscillators against each other to create a more lush and interesting sound. So I'm going to take my second oscillator and detune it by an octave, and my third oscillator I'm going to put up by a fifth, which is 7 semitones. When tuning oscillators, anything to the left of the decimal point will be semitones and anything to the right will be cents. Here's how it sounds now. This is starting to sound a little bit more lush, but because I have 3 sawtooth waves, this will sound even better if I detune them slightly from each other in cents instead of semitones as well. Massive has a really great option under the voicing tab in the middle called unisono spread. And what that does is it stacks your oscillators on top of each other and it detunes all of them against each other. So instead of only having 3 oscillators, if I increase this number, it will multiply those 3 oscillators based on this unisono number. So for example, 5 in unisono is 5 times these 3 oscillators together. To detune them against each other, I turn on unisono spread, and then I just move this slider a little bit to the right. What this does is it detunes from 0 semitones to 1 semitone. And this is what it sounds like before with unisono, and then I'll detune it. And this is with the detuning. As you can hear, it sounds bigger, thicker, and it just has that impact that we're looking for besides just a plain old sawtooth wave stack. So unisono spread is an incredible tool for detuning your oscillators and making sounds bigger than they actually are. In this voicing tab, we also have options for polyphony. If something is polyphonic, you can play multiple notes at the same time, like a chord. And if it's monophonic, you can only play 1 note at a time, which is good for synth leads and synth bass. I'm going to make a chordal sound now, so I'm going to keep it polyphonic. And I'm going to increase the voicing, which is how many notes can play at the same time as well, just so I have as big of a sound as I can possibly get. After you've chosen your oscillator sounds, then we can move to the next section of the synth, which is going to be the filter. Massive has two filters, and I'm going to show how to use one of them first, and then we can combine both of them if we decide to. In order to get all of my oscillators to go into filter number 1, I'm going to click on each of these sliders to turn them up. Now I'm going to go into filter 1 and choose a low pass filter, which is the most common filter that you see on most synthesizers. The parameters that show up are cutoff and resonance. Cutoff, or cutoff frequency, is the point at which it starts cutting off high frequencies because it's a low pass filter. Because my cutoff is turned all the way down, that means it's cutting everything off. So if I play back my keyboard, I hear nothing. However, if I start opening up that cutoff frequency, gradually it'll start bringing in low frequencies until it builds up to the original sound that we had before. Resonance, which is the other parameter here, is essentially adding gain to wherever this cutoff frequency is. It makes it sound more obvious as a filter and just adds another dimension to the sound. If you want to use both filters, or just one, just change these sliders to control which oscillator is being sent to which filter. You can also choose to have these in series or in parallel. Right now they're in parallel, which means that all of the signal is going through each of the filters at the same time. If you have it in series, it will go from filter 1 into filter 2. I'm going to keep my cutoff frequency pretty high, but I'm going to take it down just a little bit on the resonance. You can also experiment with other filters that Massive has. For example, the scream filter will drive the resonance and give it a little bit more crunch. Depending on what type of music you're making, this can be really useful. However, I'm going to keep it with a simple low-pass filter for this sound. The next step in Massive is working with the amp modulator or amp envelope. This is going to be the envelope that controls the volume of your sound over time. Massive has this hardwired into envelope number 4, and if you forget that, you can always look to where it says amp mod, and there's a little number 4 there. You can change this around if you choose, but it is the way that Massive is wired. If you click on envelope number 4 here, you'll see the attack, decay, sustain, and release. The two most important parts of this are going to be attack and release. So, for example, synth leads and synth basses have fast attacks, which means as soon as you hit the key, it comes in. However, pads tend to have longer attacks. They take a little bit longer to creep in, and longer releases that take a little bit more time to fade out. This middle parameter right here is going to be a combination of your decay and sustain, which is as you're holding the key down, it's going to slightly reduce in volume. So if you want to control this and have it stay consistently loud as you hold the key down, you can just click and drag this section up and it will stay. Depending on what sound you're trying to make, the attack and release are going to be crucial. My sound is going to be pad-like, so I'm going to have a longer attack, but not super long, and the same thing with the release. Okay. You can adjust these parameters however you like depending on the sound you're making. Just remember that envelope number 4 is always going to be tied into the amp or the loudness. This curve that we're looking at right now will control the loudness of our sound over time based on how we hit the keys. Sometimes you want to put some movement in your sound and you want to have it change over time. To do this, we use modulators like envelopes and LFOs. We already talked about one of the envelopes to control our amp or our volume. We can also use envelopes to control other parameters of the synth as well. However, the most common modulator that you run into on most synthesizers is the LFO, which stands for low frequency oscillator. If I click on LFO 5, you can see that it has a sine wave for my LFO frequency. LFOs are too low for us to hear, but we use the shape of them to affect the synth. So, for example, a square wave on the LFO would act like a normal light switch, just on and off. So wherever we put this LFO, it will change that parameter 100% to 0, 100% to 0 with nothing in between. For a sine wave, we have some variation in between, more like a dimmer light switch. It has some in-between areas between all the way up and all the way down. So you want to make sure that you choose the correct shape for your LFO depending on the sound that you're trying to create. One of the most common areas that we hear LFOs is on the cutoff frequency. In order to apply an LFO or an envelope or any modulator to anywhere on massive, you click on this little cross, hold it, drag it, and drop it to any empty box on the entire synth. If there's an empty box, we can modulate it. Once you've dropped the modulator, you need to choose a range that you want it to change. For example, do I want the range of this sine wave to be all of my cutoff frequencies or just a small portion? To create a range, you click on the number that you dropped, click, drag it, and create whatever range you desire. Let's hear how it sounds if I make the range the entire cutoff spectrum. This is a really cool sound, but it might be a little bit too extreme. If I want something a little bit more gentle, I can reduce this range and make it a little more subtle. I can also change the rate of this LFO. Or sync it to my BPM. Let's just say I want to put it in quarter notes. A square wave sounds like this. Whereas the sine wave sounds like this. You can hear that there is a little bit of a difference between all the way on and all the way off. I'm going to reduce the range of this because I want it to be more subtle, and I'm going to keep it synced to a quarter note. You can use any of these LFOs to affect any empty box you have in the synth, or if you don't want a continuous change like an LFO, you can use an envelope that works at a different rate to the envelope that you're using for the amp modulator. So, for example, if I'd like my cutoff to open slower than my amp modulator, then I could add an envelope to my cutoff. I'm going to mute this LFO first so I can just hear the envelope. Once again, you want to create a range. And I'm going to make the attack of my envelope that's controlling the cutoff longer than the attack on my amp envelope. That means that this cutoff is going to open slower than the amp. So let's hear how that sounds. This is another useful effect, and remember, if you're using an envelope, it's going to be based on overall time, whereas the LFO will be one continuous modulation. I'm going to keep my LFO. I like that effect the best. I'll just adjust the range again to get it more to what I want. Okay. to your modulators, there are other effects that also come with the synth. We have a noise generator that you can add and change different types of noise. For this type of sound, I really like the bright noise option, and I can control how bright and how much we hear as well. It's also useful to place a modulator, like an envelope, on the color as well to give it more swell. And you can slowly hear that noise creeping in. We also have feedback for our filters if you'd like to add a little bit more crunch. And we have insert effects that include distortion type effects and bit crushers. It doesn't really work for this particular sound. However, these are options that you can use as well. Lastly, we have our main effects, which are usually reverbs, some compressors, delays, etc. For this sound, I'd like to hear some reverb on it. And I'm also going to reduce the amount of the noise on this particular sound. You can also add delays on the effect as well to give it more dimension. I like to sync my delays to the BPM as well. I'm going to put an eighth note and a quarter note. And there's also an EQ for this as well. So if I want to increase some of the brightness or reduce some of the low frequencies, I can do that too. Now this sound is nice and thick. It's got a lot going on sonically. And if I put this into a mix, it's really going to complete the chordal structure of this song. So I'm going to close Massive for a second. So let's hear this instrumental without the pad and then we'll add it in. All right, so let's add it. Now that you know how to create a sound from scratch, anytime that you load a preset, you'll be able to recognize the areas that you can change to make it work better for whatever you're making. To save any presets that you make, go to File, Save As, and you can call it whatever you want. I'm going to call this Chrissy Pad. So here's the sound that we came up with. And here's the sound we started with. Even a really simple sound like this can go really far with Massive.